Hi, we continue today in Luke 22 after the narrator has shifted the scene from Jesus and the apostles about to prepare for Passover over to Judas conspiring with the chief priests and their soldiers to betray Jesus. It's an incredibly dramatic literary construction, and here Luke is following Mark in ways, but is also shaping it his own ways, as we've been seeing in the last couple of videos. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Luke 22 and 23, I encourage you to do so, where I go over a number of the things that are unique to Luke, including a little more detail on what you can see on the right side of the screen on this chart, an overly simplistic comparison of each evangelist's purpose. And it should not be a surprise that we get to this point that Luke is continuing to serve the audience of his elite young Romans, trying to offer them the choice between the Pax Romana and the Pax Christi, which is to say the peace that comes through empire and the peace that comes from listening to the Creator God. And although all the Gospels, including John, have a passion story, of course, and a portrayal of Jesus' crucifixion, each shapes it for their own purpose, as you can see here. And part of how Luke shapes it, you can see here in this chart, where you can see a whole series of chiasms, and we'll look at each of those as we go. Today we'll see the one in verses 7 to 13 of chapter 22 that comes right after the section about Judas and the chief priests that I was just noting. And then it'll follow a number of things that we see in all the Gospels, but also some unique things. So if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to watch the introductory video as we go over all those things. Here you can see the chiasm for this unit, and if you have not been familiar with chiasms, I've been showing them throughout all my Radical Bible series here. It's where the beginning and the end are symmetrical and the inner part is symmetrical, usually characterized by A, B, C, B, A in the case of a 5-part one, or A, B, A in a 3-part, etc. So what you can see here plainly is Passover on each side and prepare the Passover on each side, where to make preparations and make preparations there, and then the very mysterious, strange conspiracy thing of meeting the man with the water jar who will lead you to a house and show you an already furnished room. So that's similar in all the Gospels, as we'll see in a moment, but we'll look at how Luke fits that into his story. So as you can see here, this is the shorter version of what I showed in the introductory video, where I showed Luke 22, 1 to 13, and last time 1 to 6 with just the Judas part. But what's key to the differences that you can't see here is that Mark's and Matthew's follow after the story of the woman who anoints Jesus, and we saw on the introductory video that Luke, of course, includes that back in Luke 7, and not in the situation just before the Last Supper. So that's one of the differences in narrative context. But as you can see in language here, Luke follows Mark almost exactly here, and yet so differently throughout, as I showed in the synoptic comparison of the Judas story, and as we'll see as we look through the rest of chapter 22. So the part in plain text is the part that he takes from Mark, and the part that's purple is the part that's unique to Luke. And really all that's unique to Luke is how it's introduced. Rather than it being the disciples generally saying to him, where do you want us to go to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover, here it's Jesus' idea, and he sends two particular people, Peter and John, to go do that for us, not for you, but for us. So it's going to be a shared meal, and there's no sense it is separate for Jesus, or they're just simply serving Jesus. They're serving one another. But as you can see, the story is almost identical. There's only a couple of small details otherwise that Luke changes. And Matthew similarly follows a similar pattern, although it's shorter in Matthew, and we don't need to worry about that now. So let's leave this up as we begin to look through our passage, and we'll see some of the details of why Luke has done it his way. So one of the things we need to look at in general is, why is this scene happening? We can so easily take for granted that the story unfolds the way it does that we fail to ask, but why? In other words, there's been no Passover meal the entire rest of the book. Why right here? And certainly the obvious reason is that Luke, as following Mark, is trying to portray what Jesus is doing as an exodus. And we saw that explicitly in Luke at the Transfiguration, where only Luke's narrator says that Moses and Elijah were talking to Jesus about his exodus. And so we saw that earlier, and we saw the echo of that with Judas conferring with the chief priests and soldiers, echoing ironically Jesus using the same Greek word, conferring with Moses and Elijah about his exodus. So plainly one of the issues is that this is going to be portrayed as an exodus, and the Passover lamb that you can see noted on the left side of the screen, even though the Greek does not have the word lamb, is a key element of Jesus' relationship with that. And the fact that it doesn't say lamb is important, because although John's Gospel, along with the book of Revelation, explicitly calls Jesus the Lamb of God, Luke does not. So we can't assume that Luke's doing the same thing that John is doing, especially since Mark and Matthew don't do that similar thing either. Another aspect of this is, came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover had to be sacrificed. Just as Passover meal is simply Pascha in the Greek, Passover lamb is just Pascha. So the translators here are supplying lamb and meal, but it's really the same word each time. And I left meal in here and I left lamb in there so it wouldn't be confusing to follow the translation over here, but really it's all just the Passover. The lamb is implied by the fact that the word sacrifice is used, that we'll look at in just a moment. But this is, as we'll see in the next video, on the 7th of 8 meal scenes in Luke. The final one will be the Emmaus meal scene in chapter 24. And so at one level, it completes Luke's unique version of that, of counting up to the complete number 7. But again, it begs the question of why this specific Passover meal. And the answer to that will only unfold as we look at the next scene, when we see what Jesus does in relation to the elements of the Passover Seder meal. And again, compare how Luke does that differently than not only Mark and Matthew, but how Luke's is similar to what Paul says he received from others as he reports it to his audience in 1 Corinthians. So we'll look more at that next time. So just focusing on what we have here, on the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover had to be sacrificed. And the word for had to, dei, implies divine necessity, and that should not be surprising, because the word for sacrifice here, theusthai, only other use is in Luke 15:23-30, in the story of the offering the fatted calf when the prodigal son returns. But it plainly echoes the origin stories in the Septuagint in Exodus 12:21, when they're told while they're still in Egypt to offer the lamb and sacrifice, or in Deuteronomy when Moses is summarizing it on the eve of crossing over to the Jordan, when it specifies it should take place in Jerusalem, the city which Yahweh will designate to have his name on it, as it's described in Deuteronomy 16, along with the other feasts as well. So that's what leads us to have this Passover celebration in Jerusalem while they're there. And of course, one of the reasons we might have not seen it otherwise is this is the first time they're in Jerusalem with Jesus as an adult. He was in Jerusalem in chapter 2, but there was no Passover feast named specifically there, although it was the season of Passover. So that's at least some context for what's going on here. So here, and you can see that in verse 8 is the part that's unique to Luke. You can see on the right side of the screen. So Jesus sent Peter and John, and that's a very interesting thing. We'll look at that more in a second, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it. Again, the us there is the unique element. Otherwise, it's going to be the same as the response here in verse 9 is the same as the question there, but only Luke has Jesus directing them to do this. And you might wonder about their response. Their response is simply where, because obviously go and prepare does not imply where. They obviously don't live in Jerusalem. They're Galileans, and so it's not obvious where that would be. And so it's a perfectly reasonable question, but they don't suggest any other difference in the context. Had they been having Passover meals before with Jesus? All the other meals we've seen with Jesus and the disciples have been other people's houses or in other contexts. So this is the first one we're seeing just with them. So let's look at the Peter and John role for a moment here. As you can see on my chart on the right side, I note that in Mark, Peter and John are found together for a series of passages, but always with James. So Peter, James, and John and James are described as brothers there, the sons of Zebedee, which we don't hear directly here, as a trio of insiders, if you will, or some kind of elite group, although only Peter, as we'll see, is given specific power of any kind. In Mark, we don't see that here in John in the same, or in Luke in the same way. And Matthew, they're only together for the Transfiguration, also with James. So Matthew drops Mark's having them together in the apocalyptic discourse in Jesus' prayer, as well as in the healing of Jairus' daughter, where it's only Peter that goes in. In John, they're never named together, which is just a way that John is different. But in Luke they are. Here, obviously, is the only time in Luke, but twice in Acts. And although I only have one verse here, you can see from Acts 3:1 to 4:23, they're the main characters there. So they go up to the temple and heal the man at the Beautiful Gate, and there's a long story of them giving a speech and getting arrested and then getting out of jail and giving another speech. So they'll be the focus there. And then they'll also be the focus here in chapter 8. When the apostles at Jerusalem heard that Samaria had accepted the word of God, they sent Peter and John down to them, and they helped them receive the Holy Spirit and laid hands on them. So they serve a certain role there, but it stops there. And perhaps that's because after those chapters in Acts, Paul and his partners take center stage in the journey of the gospel out across the Roman Empire. But it's hard to know. But at least we know that Luke will include Peter and John there, so he's setting that up with our scene right here. So he sent Peter and John to go and prepare the Passover meal. So they asked him where. And where might they imagine? The answer that comes is certainly nothing they can imagine, and yet they ask no questions about it. Everything about this story in verses 10 to 12, which, as I was noting, is almost identical to what Mark's original story of, is suspicious. So let's look at some of the details and see why. So first, listen, which is idu in Greek, which literally is look. Why the New RSV translates a word that means look as listen, you'd have to ask them. But it's pay attention, basically, like hine in Hebrew. So pay attention, he said to them. When you have entered the city, they're out near the Mount of Olives, and that's where Jesus will have his prayer after the supper, although it says he went out to the Mount of Olives at that point, so it's not exactly clear where they are before they enter into the city and have the meal at the house that Peter and James are being sent to find right now. So they enter the city, and they hear this, a man carrying a jar. And the word for man here is anthropos, so it doesn't have to be a man. It could be anybody, although the verbs are male. But the gender is important here, because the normal gender issue would be a woman would carry a jar of water. For example, as we see in John 4, the woman of Samaria who has her jar of water and comes out to the well at noon to get water. Now, in John's Gospel, the fact that she's there at noon is what's unusual, but it's not unusual that a woman is there, and that's the usual time, usual place for women to gather. The usual time would be first thing in the morning, which makes sense, and in the evening, in preparation for their meals and their caring for children, etc. So there's a reason in John's Gospel why she's there at noon. But the issue for our purpose is the fact that the normal person to be gathering water is a woman. So the fact that it's going to be a man, although gendered anthropos, neutral here, is part of what makes it unusual here. So a person carrying here, bastazo, we've seen carrying a number of times, a jar of water here, a keramion. You can hear the word ceramic in that, suggesting pottery. And it's that word keramion is only in the New Testament in the Mark parallel, so Luke taking it from Mark. It's twice in Isaiah and once in Jeremiah, but not particularly related to our situation. So it's also an unusual word. It's not the word for the water jar of the woman in Samaria. And so the fact that it's an unusual word, though, does not mean it would be easy to find. It's not like it's a particular kind of jar. This is certainly not suggesting there's something unusual about the jar. But a water jar will meet you. Suna to say here, and only one other time in Luke, and if we go back to that, we can see that's the crowd that comes down after the Mountain of Transfiguration. I want to highlight that because the meeting suggests, as we see in 937, the initiative is on the one who will meet. And so here it's suggesting not that they will find the one with the water jar, but the man with the water jar will find them. How does he know them, or how will we know to look for them? We don't know. But all of this is suggesting that Jesus has some advanced group of people in Jerusalem who are already on his side that the disciples don't already know. Because Jesus is not directing to, the guy we met the other day or the guy I told you about. This all seems strange to them. And so it's interesting that Jesus seems to have a relationship with both the man with the water jar, who Christy Cobb suggests is a slave based on the fact that there's a master of the house, and we'll look at that in a moment. And curiously, it also reverses the sense of following, because the word for follow here is the usual follow Jesus word for discipleship following, as in the command follow me, as we see back in chapter 5. But here it's follow him into the house that he enters and say to the master of the house, always translated here owner of the house, but really master of the house is what's important here. You can see oka despate, you can hear despot in there as suggesting master. So it's not about ownership, it's about control. And as you can see from these three passages from 12:39, 13:25, and 14:21, we've seen the term oikodespota 3 times in parables, and always as someone who's either positive or someone one should be concerned about. And it'd be interesting to apply each of these responses to Peter and John when they got there, as if they could experience any of these things rather than what's happening there. Maybe just a little joke for astute listeners there. So say to the master of the house, notice, don't say anything to the man with the jar. Is that perhaps to stay quiet on the street and only reveal who you're associated with when you get in the house? Because you follow him into the house he enters. So once they're into the house, say to the master of the house, the teacher asks you, and this is the last time we hear didaskalos, the word for teacher, of the many times you can see down below. As we saw in the unit on authority in 2021 and those sections there, it was used by Jesus' opponents usually as a suggestion they're not totally with him. They don't call him, for example, Lord. But here, Jesus is using this word to say that they should use the reference teacher and referring back to Jesus, to the owner of the house. It's certainly not suggesting it's lesser, but perhaps it's even in this semi-public place a way of downplaying the importance of Jesus for the sake of not getting people in trouble. But certainly as the things unfold in the scene, Jesus will not be holding back. Teacher asks you, where is the guest room? And as I was noting in the introductory video in the last one, this is one of many echoes we're going to see from the first chapters, so-called infancy narrative chapters in Luke 1 and 2. And that should not surprise us that it comes full circle. Some scholars have suggested, as I looked at when we looked at Luke 1 and 2, that those were additions afterward. They seem to have different tone than the rest of Luke, but I completely disagree because we can see it's tightly integrated into this text as it is. And it should not be surprising that Luke 1 and 2 express the hope and the promise, and now we're seeing some of the ironic fulfillment that God's visitation is coming, but not in the way that maybe Zechariah or Simeon expected. So where's the kataluma, which is exactly the question of what there was no room for Mary and Joseph to have when she was pregnant. It's only in the parallel in Mark, elsewhere in the New Testament. And we also see a different word for the inn that the Samaritan brings the injured person to there in Luke 10. So bringing back kataluma there, and presumably there's room here. So this isn't just somebody's private room. This is suggesting a commercial establishment where there is space ready. And in Jerusalem at the Passover would really be a crowded situation, as scholars have been estimating since the 1960s with Joachim Jeremias that the population of Jerusalem may have well tripled from roughly 60,000 to 180,000 at the time of Passover. And those numbers are very rough. It's almost impossible to guess. But it would have been very crowded, and of course anybody coming from outside the city would be looking for lodging. And so the fact that they can presume that there's space or that Jesus reserves a space suggests some kind of inside knowledge and inside relationships we just don't know about. So he tells Peter and John to ask the question, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? So not just where's the guest room, but specifying that. And notice this, disciples here, it's apostles in verse 14, and then disciples later. And Luke goes back and forth at those, and we'll see how that plays out, allowing a looser understanding of who those are. Notice that plays out against also the 12 that we heard that Judas is one of. But it didn't say 12 apostles or 12 disciples. It simply said the 12. So just as we saw in the previous video that Jesus' opponents have various names throughout, Jesus' followers do too, as 12, as apostles, or as disciples. And so this is, once they ask the question, this is what Jesus tells them will happen. He will show you deiknomai 33 times in the New Testament, and none in the Septuagint, but we see it several times also in Luke, and we'll see it one more time in the Road to Emmaus story near the very end, and a couple times in Acts. A large room, on a guy here, again only in Mark on the parallel, implying a wealthy owner, as Cobb suggests, not only for having a slave, someone to carry water for them, but also to have a guest room. And whether it's a wealthy owner or simply a commercial establishment isn't 100% clear. Already furnished. Strunuo here, only here in Luke, again following Mark. Cobb notes it literally means to spread out, as on blankets outside. And it should not be surprised it's furnished because it's a commercial establishment. So it's already ready. And then make preparations for us there. Using the key word throughout that fills out the chiasm here. And so notice they don't ask any questions. They receive all this. They don't say, how will we know the guy with the water jar? What if there's more than one person with a water jar? What if the owner of the house asks questions? They don't seem to be concerned about what if this strange mission doesn't go as according to Jesus' plan, but it does. So they went and found, not quite seeking and finding, as we saw the word for seeking, zedio, was used by the chief priests in seeking a way to remove Jesus, but they didn't for fear of the crowd. So they sought, but only found because of Judas's betrayal. Here, Peter and John go and then found everything as he had told them, and they prepared. And again, the meal is not there, just prepared the Passover. And as I note below, suggesting the men did the women's work, or the women were part of the group already, which is Cobb's point, that there's certainly, by having the loose phrase disciples here, that would include all the women who had followed from Galilee we heard about in chapter 8, and certainly those who we'll see at the foot of the cross who certainly followed all this way. So although art, obviously starting with Da Vinci's Last Supper, portrays what seemed to be all men, we have no reason to believe that the Last Supper doesn't include women and servants and others in this rented space. And when the hour comes, he took his place at the table, and that's where we'll pick up next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.